Despite what pedants who still cite that one Roger Ebert quote may say, video games are an art form, by my estimation, one of the most accomplished art forms out there, able to work in ranges of tone and emotion that film or literature couldn't hope to accomplish on the merit of player interaction alone. It's also an ever-evolving art form. That evolution comes in many forms. We're over halfway through the year now, and it's been a pretty good year for games. Well, it's been a pretty good year for certain kinds of games. Mostly sequels and remakes. We've seen the stellar Dead Space and Resident Evil 4 remakes, and for sequels, we've had fantastic continuations of franchises like Jedi Fallen Order, Tears of the Kingdom, and most recently Baldur's Gate 3. There have, of course, been some solid indie games here and there that I've personally enjoyed. But sometimes I have to wonder, is this it? Of course it's not. The game industry always has more to offer than just the new flavor of the month, but as I've spent more than a decade following the game industry, first as a hobby, then as a proper job, both in journalism and development, I've often wondered, the games just get bigger and shinier, more involving, and in some ways more involved. But then, what happens when they fade from the zeitgeist? I'll just get to my main point. Let me put it this way. If we all agree that games are art, why don't we have any museums? I'm not saying literal museums, by the way, and many people would probably point to digital storefronts like Steam, GOG, and Xbox as the modern equivalent for games, but they're not really. You can go play modern games, but there are plenty of games from previous generations that get forgotten and left behind. In my documentary on the creation of Condemned 2, I note this to be a problem. Here's a game that dozens of people poured their creativity, hard work, and lives into for years. It's a game that means a lot to the people who made it and the people who play it. But now, how can anyone interested go see it without tracking down a copy for an outdated system? With a book, they don't go out of print. If they do, you can always find a copy somewhere else. Films are so ubiquitous across formats that you're always able to find a copy of almost anything across streaming, Blu-ray, or DVDs. Now, what I mean by museum is, why don't we have a better way to appreciate the games of yesteryear? The ones that just get left behind. Because to me, appreciation isn't just the ability to play a game. Anyone can sit down and just press some buttons, mindlessly ticking boxes and grinding through multiplayer matches. I mean, whomst among us didn't have an Overwatch phase? I mean, I wouldn't say I really took the time to appreciate Overwatch. No, to really appreciate Overwatch, you go to this website, just type it in your search bar. It's called PORNHU. No, what I really enjoy is slowing down a bit. Appreciating the artistry of the game. For art in general, I think much of the time that includes appreciating the story behind a work of art. You can read a Kafka story, but when you learn about his upbringing, much of the work can take on a different tone. And I think this can also apply to pieces of art that most people might not think of being serious art. For all my horror heads out there, take the 1977 Japanese camp classic Hausu. If you've never seen it, Hausu is an intentionally strange, surreal, and often comedic fever dream about a group of girls fighting ghosts. It's an absolute trip of a film, playing out like Evil Dead 1 by way of David Lynch from director Nobuhiko Obayashi. So, watching it, you might think, hey, this is a goofy good time, as one by one the girls' childhood friends fall prey to strange ghosts. You may even be tempted to think the ever-dreaded first impulse of many a Caucasian seeing some piece of obscure Japanese media for the first time and go, man, Japan sure is weird, right? But then you find out that Obayashi incorporated an intentionally childlike worldview into his script. He asked his own daughter for ideas of what would be scary or interesting. But he also put his own childhood into the film, namely the fact that Obayashi grew up in Hiroshima as a child, and lost his friends in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and its sister city, Nagasaki. Suddenly, this silly film about losing friends as a youth takes on a different tone, doesn't it? It goes from being a surreal, goofy film to a conversation. Is Obayashi trying to use comedy to alleviate the pain of losing someone you love? Is he intentionally tapping into the horror of youth unprepared for the gravity of an adult world that's been forced onto them? You have this additional context, and now this piece of art, and your understanding of it, can be elevated. It's why, to me, Quake 2, a game from 1997, is possibly the most important and artistic video game release of the year. Right off the bat, you might laugh at the idea of a game like Quake 2 being mentioned as art, or that there's much artistry to be appreciated in this game. Well, I hope you stick with this video, and let me prod at those assumptions a bit, because I hope I can change your mind. A game like Quake 2 is just as much a work of art as something like a book or a painting, but we'll get to that. Developed by Portmasters Night Dive and released during QuakeCon 2023, Quake 2 is a wonderful remaster that honestly hedges closer to being a remake due to several smart additions. In the tradition of the stellar remaster of Quake from a few years ago, this is the definitive edition of id's classic shooter. You've got a wealth of graphical options to suit your needs. Whether you want to relive the grungy, pixelated original style, appreciate the colorful, smooth remastered lighting and character models, or modify the visuals to something in between. It should be noted that under Bethesda, id Software's catalog has been wonderfully preserved and distributed across most modern platforms. Doom, Doom 2, and Doom 3 have all received great ports that, for Doom and Doom 2, also include the ability to easily install and play approved Doom mods, meaning that in these already classic and incredibly replayable games, you get a nearly unlimited amount of content. All the Doom you can eat, for reasonable price points too. Similarly, Night Dive worked hard to bring the cult classic Doom 64 to those same consoles after the Doom trilogy. But back to Quake 2. The gunplay is, of course, tight, but also aided by a new hit marker, a Doom 2016-style radio weapon selection that slows down time as you choose your next weapon, and an optional compass that points the way towards your next objective, Dead Space style, so you're never left wandering too long in the game's typically old-school labyrinths. I also want to say that, of all Doom 2016's contributions to shooters, the slow-mo radio weapon menu might be one of the best and smartest. And then, of course, there's the content. You've got the original game, both previously released expansions, and Call of the Machine, an entirely new campaign developed by the Wolfenstein maestros at Machine Games. Call of the Machine has 28 full levels, making it essentially an entirely new Quake game. The levels and gameplay here have the same appearance and flow of classic Quake, but take advantage of the light years of advancement in horsepower to craft more intricate environments, involve set pieces, and throw plenty more enemies at the player. It's a great milestone that serves to remind that classic gameplay is always going to be fun, but we've learned so much since 1997. But then there's one other thing that stood out to me. Quake 2 64. At first I assumed, perhaps naively, that it was just an alternative version of Quake 2 with different levels, lighting, or balance changes, but no, this is an entirely different game. Quake 2 64 in the tradition of Doom 64 is a ground-up unique experience, even sharing a composer with Doom 64 and Aubrey Hodges, who brings back the same unsettling gothic dirges to the id library. Then there's the classic multiplayer, which fans old and new can connect to and easily find matches just like people were doing in their dorm rooms in 1997. As I downloaded the game and explored the menus and various campaigns, however, one more thing stood out to me on the menu. A tab called the id Vault. Now, if you've played games for any amount of time, you've probably seen countless pieces of unlockable concept art. Hidden concept art menus are just databases with lore dumps about weapons, enemies, and more. So technically, this is nothing new for video games. But what makes art special often is the time it's made in, the context of the world around it. For a 1997 first-person shooter, artistry and preservation were probably the last thing on the developers' minds. Throughout the 90s, while id Software was a highly successful developer due to the seismic shift brought on by Doom and later Quake, it was also one fraught with internal strife and controversy. I recommend reading Masters of Doom, which is a great book on a piece of gaming history that everyone should check out. Quake 2, for example, was for most of its development not a Quake game. That's why its art style and story have nothing to do with the gloomy gothic horror of the first Quake. You play as a space marine fighting the cybernetic monstrosities of the Strogg, not the eldritch, unspeakable monsters of the old ones. It's a game that was brought to life by only 13 people, a far cry from the AAA teams of today that can reach into the hundreds. John Romero was off making you, personally, his bitch, so this was the first major id Software game without his involvement. And if you know anything about the crunch culture of the 1990s, you'll know it's probably safe to assume the hours worked and effort put in to bring this game to life could easily be described as inhumane, if I had to bet. Aside from the game itself, what remains of this effort? Not much. Unsurprisingly, not a lot of concept art or development materials were archived. I wonder if anyone on the team thought at the time if anyone would care about this game 5 years later, or 10, or now more than 20. In remastering the game, Night Dive went through the effort to seek out and compile what assets they could find and give context with little blurbs inside the id Vault. And while these simple drawings and untextured models might not seem like much, this is an absolute treasure trove for an invaluable piece of gaming history from an era where so little survived. The descriptions of some concept art pieces even seem to note how little care was taken with the documents themselves, which apparently were found by chance in a box with art from other games. The scanned HD pages show scribbled math equations on the same pages as weapon concepts, like it was a piece of scratch paper in a high school math class. Another design document outlining the style of late-game levels is stained by coffee rings. Even looking at many of these concepts, many of them seem to be little more than the kind of notebook doodles I and so many other fans of games like this would scribble in the margins of their notebooks during boring classes in middle school. Yet these scribbles would be brought to screaming, adrenaline-pumping life by the dedicated team behind Quake 2. One of the things I admire most about this particular era of smaller team game design was the dedication to going with your gut. Of course, developers wanted to make something cohesive and fun to play, but so many of these enemy designs and weapons began as whatever someone thought would look cool. Personal passion, made manifest and enjoyed by an audience of hundreds of thousands. But that's just the concept art. Development assets, including cut assets and things that were cut, abound throughout, painting a more clear story of how Quake 2 was brought to life piece by piece. We get a look at the tools the team used to edit the character models, which the developers crafted pixel by pixels into the monsters players would slay in droves. The kind of enemies featured in countless games, which went through months of iteration, design changes, and artistic experimentation, only to be largely ignored by 99% of the players who rampage through them. On the subject of being brought to life in-game, there are plenty of iterations of enemies that would be cut and models that would later be changed in the final game. This isn't uncommon in game development, even now, but looks at the iterative process are rare and really allow you to appreciate how fine details are developed over time. As someone who has worked in similarly iterative games, most people don't realize how minute details can get on iterative design. Hours can be spent on details that may seem insignificant or that go entirely unnoticed, but in the end, it's the same collaboration that makes game design so unique as an art form. There are an assortment of untextured models, ranging from cut enemies that never made it past the concepting stage, to items that were cut as gameplay elements were adjusted or removed. For some of these models, they are the only surviving evidence that they ever existed, as there's no other surviving art assets resembling them. And finally, there's an assortment of 3D models to view, including the ability to alternate between the models enhanced for this release and the original id Software joints. 3D models have often been my favorite ways to appreciate the artistry of games, as you zoom in on the gory textures and make out the fine details you'd never come to see during gameplay. Personally, I find it endlessly inspiring, the same way I admire the work of H.R. Giger. Just look at these things. Who thought of this? Why did they make the decisions they did? What inspired them? Maybe it's just me, but I adore this kind of thing. Then there's an absolute grail of game preservation here. Playable versions of the demos featured at E3 and a separate demo from ECTS 1997, both of which have been restored to reflect the state of the game at the time. The demos feature different level layouts from the finished game and give players copious amounts of weapons and ammo, eliminating the main game's balance of ammo in favor of injecting the gory, fast-paced action directly into the brains of the journalists who played it. At the time, the game industry was the Wild West. All-time classics like Metal Gear Solid and Ocarina of Time, which would redefine what many thought games could do, were still on the horizon. That's to say, comparatively, it was an art form coming out of its infancy, and as a result, precious few development assets from projects like Quake 2 have survived, least of all being the demos that would quickly be cobbled together for E3 show floors year after year. Now, you might ask, why does all this matter? I still don't get what makes this an important game. Well, Quake 2 is one of the most appreciative artistic releases I've seen for a game in quite some time. Understandably, we don't get a lot of games that give this much attention to archive demos, cut assets, and model viewers, but it gets more uncommon with even older games. For all we know, these assets are all that survived from the game's original development. Think about that. Years of these developers' lives spent struggling together to will this experience into the world. Dozens of pieces of art, untold amount of collaborations and iterations on designs for weapons, environments, UI, and story. Who knows if anyone will ever see them again? For now, though, we have these few coffee-stained documents, cut enemy models, and scribbled concept art to help fill in the blanks on the game's development. I mentioned earlier how you have to take context into account when admiring art, and for games, the development is part of that context, one that seldom gets taken into consideration when you look at the video essays, think pieces, and nostalgic reflection games inspire. It's one of the reasons I try so hard to center developers and their experiences in my documentaries on underappreciated or nearly forgotten games. It makes me think of my Paradise Killer documentary, where while talking with one of the developers in a segment that didn't make it into the video, he remarked on one of my silly videos where I played Shellshock 2 Blood Trails, ranking it against 30 plus other Xbox 360 shooters. He told me how rough the development of that game was, and that he was surprised to hear anyone remember it or enjoying anything about it. And as I think about how little survived from the development of Quake 2, I can't help but wonder about the games from E3 1997 that didn't go on to become classics. How many countless hours were spent dreaming up interesting levels, stories, experiences that never made it into a game? How many artists will never have some of their favorite work seen? How many creative, collaborative pieces of art will be left unappreciated? Unfortunately, it's the way of the game industry. Most companies would rather remake a game from the ground up or simply remaster it, or just make a sequel. It's not realistic or feasible for most games to get the treatment Quake 2 has received here. This is a definitive release, compiling the original game, its name-only console counterpart, forgotten development assets, a new campaign, and so much more. And as a result, when viewed as a full package, Quake 2 isn't just an HD remaster, it's a comprehensive experience of a time and place in gaming. The additional context given by the art and development assets, the E3 demos, the surviving documents paint a picture for fans of the world Quake 2 came from, one born of the blood, sweat, and tears of its young, talented, heavy metal-obsessed developers. On its own, you could just be playing a simple mindless FPS game, giving your way through hallways as 90s rock music players. But with that valuable additional context, it becomes a better piece of art. It becomes appreciable in a way it wasn't necessarily before. A lot of people link good art to an emotional reaction. The more something draws you in, connects with you, and draws a reaction, odds are plenty of people, especially in the game industry, will hold it up as an example of games as art. This release of Quake 2 manages to inspire plenty of reactions from me personally. As I play through the game and see the environments mentioned in the design documents, I slow down a bit more and take in the surroundings. In the distant skyboxes, I can make out vague shapes resembling the bold landscape shown in the game's concept art. I notice small differences between the levels featured in the E3 demos journalists excitedly played more than 2 decades ago, when I was just 2 years old. That was a long time ago. I wonder how many other people would care as much about this stuff as I do. But even if they don't, I'm having a great time with Quake 2, playing it for the first time. And as I experience these chunky pixels with fresh eyes, everywhere I turn in the dingy digital world, I see the hard work the team put in 26 years ago. The hurried notebook scrawls of fantastical weaponry, the excitement of iterating levels into a cohesive experience for the player, late nights playtesting the multiplayer that would define a time and place for so many, and the countless cups of coffee imbibed to keep working through the exhaustion, unaware that anyone would care a quarter of a century later. Hello everyone, and thank you for watching. This was a fairly impromptu essay that just kind of came out. For a long time, I've mused about doing a video on the artistry of old school shooters like Doom, Duke, Quake, and others, and I think this wonderful release gave me the proper outlet for those thoughts. Like I said, this was just kind of video that came to me, so I followed it, which is something I can do now that I'm making videos full time. Just a little while ago, I'd have put this concept off, and this video probably would have never been made. So if you enjoyed my musings here, please like, comment, and share on your favorite Reddit pages or Twitter, and also consider giving just a crumb or two to my Patreon, which is now my primary method of paying bills. Also, be sure to check out my other videos on first-person shooters, like my video essay on Wolfenstein. As always, thank you very much for watching, and have a wonderful day.